Welcome to EduSat Network. Friend, as you know, we are having a discussion of democracy and constitutionalism. Today we have concluding lecture on democracy and its different perspective of like liberal Marxist view, what they talk about the democracy, and also we talk about the lacunae of democracy. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in a studio Dr. Aparajita Kashyap. She teaches in the university, a School of Law and Legal Study in Press University, and also have keen interest in this topic. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Kashyap for EduSat lecture on this very topic. Welcome, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you very much. A very warm welcome to the viewers. And today's topic is a continuation of what we have already been doing, constitutionalism and democracy. And this is just a step further. Without going into the meaning of constitutionalism or democracy per se, I would like to begin with a little bit of a background, and then I would go on to give the different concepts and what are the different debatable aspects of democracy which are emerging. And in this perspective, when these aspects are emerging, then what is it, what is the new perspectives and the new prescriptions which are coming? How are these new models of democracy which are being prescribed? What are the features that they have? And what are the criticisms or the shortcomings of these models or perspectives per se? So now we begin with the defining, just going into a background of definition. And as you are all aware, the most widely accepted definition is the one given by Schumpeter. And I quote, he says, "It is that institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote." So he talks about people who are in power. They are struggling because they need to acquire the people's vote. So so far this is the most plausible definition of democracy that we have. And then a very practical definition of democracy was given by Robert Dahl. Dahl went on to say that it is the right of the people to govern themselves. So very basic definition, and this is what the assumption about democracy is. Whenever we talk about assumption, a layman's perception of democracy is only about the right to choose, and this gives him the feeling that he also has a right in the participation of governance. Now, when we talk about democracy, it has got a lot of pillars, and it has got a lot of features, and the notions and perceptions that have aroused are these are the pillars. The governance by representative of the majority. So since the population has grown, it is not practical for everybody to be participating in the process of election. So or process of policy making, so we choose representatives, and the governance is done by these representatives on behalf of the population. Then it talks about a system of equity among all. Everybody is equal and equitable, and they have similar voting rights. It is not directorship or dictatorship. That means it is based on consensus. People have elected their representatives, and these representatives are people. So they cannot dictate or direct the policies. There has to be a consensus. Then it includes a system of dialogue, consultation, and most importantly, it has to take into consideration the aspirations and the interests of the stakeholders. Stakeholders meaning the people who elect and the people who get elected. So you cannot ignore the people who have put you there. And the freedom for expression and movement, that is the other important pillar. It says that if there is freedom for expression and movement, it creates room for agreements and disagreements. So we have because it is not about everybody will not agree. So there has to be consensus building, that is majority of the people will agree, and this majority principle is then again a major controversy which we are going to come back later. Now if we look at the models of democracy, how it all began, there are direct participatory and there are representative democracy. So direct participatory, it has a background in the Athenian concept of democracy, and all this while we were practicing direct democracy, A, that we did not have the institutional mechanism, and B, that the population was not so large, and so it was possible and feasible to have direct referendums and votings. So now for a while, when the population started exploding, then there were revival of institutional mechanisms. So then the interest, then we had for a time being the indirect democracy coming in, whereby the people would elect their representatives and these elected representatives would govern on their behalf. Now again, the interest in direct participatory democracy was revived in the 1890s when referendum became popular as mode of policy making. So 1890s again we have a resurrection of the direct participatory model, and 1960s, especially with the emergence of the new left, it was preferred by most of the people because this new left had a popular outlook. It wanted people's involvement. It was going against capitalism, and it thought that if we have a representative democracy, it is not in the interest of the society, so we must look at something which is people's governance, and the best that they could find was direct participatory governance. But now we're going to also see how this notion of there was busted, and it couldn't become very popular. And then again in the recent times, with modern communication methods developing, especially the social network sites and the internet revolution, we have again gone back to the model of direct participatory. Of course, physically we are not present, but through World Wide Web we are connecting, and the technical obstacles to having a direct participatory referendum or voting has been removed. And we have seen all this in all the recent movements, all the revolutions in Middle East, in for example in Libya or Egypt, and for example our own country, when we had this Anna Hazare's movement, it was all through the method of communication. People were communicating on the social network sites, and this is how the obstacle was removed, and we can see a resurrection of the direct participatory model. Now it is not without drawbacks, because it is not liked by politicians. They resist it because it is their job which is coming at perils. They will not like it. They will definitely oppose it. And also about the majority who accept Schumpeter's argument that direct democracy is incompatible with responsible government. No, so this is Schumpeter's notion, and a majority of people agree with him that direct democracy is not responsible democracy. And then so as an outcome, we had two different models. The other model, the other alternative was the representative democracy. Now this, as I told you, it came before the resurrection of the direct democracy. So it was reinvented in the 18th century. The voters elected representatives who took decisions, obviously because of practical reasons and feasibility issues. So not everybody could be ruling, so we elected representatives, and these representatives then governed on our behalf. Now the problem was that once elected, these representatives were answerable only in the next election. So much so that Rousseau, at a point of time, he argued that people in England were highly mistaken, that they had a lot of democracy. He said that people had democracy only during the elections, and once the elections are over, for the period between two elections, then they are treated as very normal in non-democratic processes. So it is a folly to believe that it is a democracy. It is democracy so far as the election process goes, and once the election is over, the actual pillars of democracy, they seem to be going away. So then, what was the role of democracy in those in a society per se? If we look at the important roles of democracy, what are the important roles? So, as we have seen in the earlier lectures, I'm just reiterating those. It's provide opportunities for everyone to articulate interests. So everyone, at least my personal interest may not be there, but at least majority people's interests are articulated. Then it mobilizes support and seeks representation. This is another important aspect, because representation, how do you seek representation? It is only through mobilizing support, and this is an important role of the democratic system. Now, this is not easy. When in the process of mobilizing support and asking for representation and articulating demands, there are bound to be different actors with different interests. Now, the catch situation is how to bargain between the different actors. And in this, while we are bargaining and we are seeking support and we are mobilizing the people, we have certain institutional punctuations. And these institutional punctuations are the procedural constraints, or the concept of constitution and constitutionalism. I will not go into the details because we have already discussed about constitution and constitutionalism. So the basic idea is that democracy can progress if there are certain boundaries or limitations drawn, and this is the role of the constitution. And while all this was happening, while all this was the contribution of democracy, there were certain problem areas which were cropping up, and one of these was that democracy was always skewed in favor of a particular interest group. So there were allegations that it is the interest of the majority which is being favored. Now Marx also he argued that if it is a capitalist society, the capitalists are a minority group, but by owning the means of production, they are the ruling group, and therefore it is also dominance by a minority. So the interest group there in a Marxist society is the capitalist class. So it always favors the interest of those who are in power, those who are in governance, and it neglects those who are not. So this is a major problem with democracy. So what is it that constitutionalism does? Now, there are rules of democracy qualified by constituting rules of order and suffrage. Obviously, democracy is a very loose concept and it differs from country to country. So we need to have some clear-cut rules in every country to define how to establish democracy, how to have democratic governments. If a democratic government is in place, what are the do's and the don'ts for the government? What are the limitations on the exercise of power by the government? So all this is the role of constitution. How much a country behaves or how much a country believes in the constitution is a measure of their constitutionalism. So a measure of the constitutional behavior could be the constitutionalism. Now, if we look at all the criticisms which are being labeled against constitutionalism and democracy in the recent years, we always tend to see that all the pro-democratic critique today, they center on the practice of judicial review. They always question the practice of judicial review, and it is also the moral rights other than democratic self-rule that cannot be lost as a result of democratic decision making. So they have to be constitutionally entrenched. So what is important is that obviously the moral rights and other democratic rights, they are the democratic rights are entrenched. You give them a constitutional status. But what about the moral rights? They are lost because they are not given constitutional status, and this is the role of constitution in a democracy. Because the moment you put a right in the constitution and it becomes constitutionally entrenched, it gets more backing, it has more validity, and then so the people, especially the indigenous groups and the tribal communities or culturally minor groups, they always talk about this aspect of moral rights having not been incorporated, and this gives rise to many problems in democracy. Having looked at all this, we now look at the debatable concepts. Now, democracy has been there and it has been practicing, but how is it degenerating? Is it becoming better? Are there problem areas? So, what are the debatable concepts? The problem arises when we have to decide who should rule. Who is the person who's fit to rule? What are the ideal institutional requirements for ruling? What kind of constitution? What kind of election machinery? What kind of government institutions do we need so that we can have a proper democratic system in place? Then once this democratic government is set up, what is the goal of that democratic government? And the last but not the least, one of the most important problems of democracy is, why should majorities rule minorities? So it is a very, very problematic areas. Now, a majority, when it comes to power, just by the fact that it is a majority, doesn't have the reason to rule. And a minority, if it comes to power, just because it is in power, it doesn't have the right to suppress. So it is a very, very delicate thread, and it has to be balanced properly in a democracy. So now, having raised certain debatable questions, we come out with certain issues. And what are these issues that I would like to address in the later part of the lecture? The center of it is undoubtedly the center of fierce debate in political theory, the concept of democracy. Then there are various criticisms leveled against the concept. The concept per se is being questioned. What do you call democracy? We have liberal democracy, we have illiberal democracy. So what is the difference between authoritarian regime and a illiberal democracy? So there are so many concepts, variants of democracy, that everybody questions the other. Then what are the perspectives? What are the ways you look at democracy? And then we have certain debates which have gone on. Debates on which is the best model, what are the alternative models that have been produced, and how in all this process then we come out with a consensus of what is good democracy, what is bad democracy, whether democracy is good to be practiced, whether we should do away with it. So all these debates are taken up in the end. Now, looking at the perspectives, I have highlighted, this is the framework of my lecture. The perspectives on democracy would be looked up with these pillars. First is the liberal aspect, then I will be taking up the neoclassical liberal aspect, socialist perspective, feminist perspective, deliberative, multiculturalist, and the youth's perspective on democracy. So one by one we would be moving from one perspective to another, and it is only befitting to start the perspective on democracy with liberalism, because this is one of the reasons why democracy is in place. So if we talk about liberal democracy, we have certain issues or certain concepts which are deeply entrenched there. The franchise, that is the right to vote, competitive elections, that is there has to be options available to us, and then the elections have to be periodical. So it is competitive, that, and there are options of in terms of representative political leaders, in terms of political parties, and the election has to be free and fair and periodical. And then we, at the end of this entire process, we have chosen a representative which is now going to govern. Now this government is formed on the basis of majority principle. Obviously everybody will not agree. So anybody who gets majority gets a chance to govern. Now the advantage of a liberal democracy is that because we have chosen those people and they are our representatives, so those in power become accountable to us. And the other important aspect about liberal democracy is that there are periodic elections. So the fear that if we do not perform, we may be voted out, this keeps the government on toes. So this concept of periodic elections, that if we do not perform, we may lose out in the next election, it makes them function properly. But then it has its own disadvantages, because once elected, then at least they have, if it is not an exceptional circumstance, at least they have a certain period of time in which they can be happy and comfortable in their governance, because the election is a little far away. Now, there are certain thinkers in the liberal perspective like Locke, Montesquieu, James Mill. They were against the principle of universal franchise. They didn't want everybody to have right to vote because they thought their feeling was everybody is not fit to govern, and they don't have enough education in democracy. So the participation in terms of choosing the government has to be limited. Now, when we go to another liberalist thinker, the stalwart, that is John Stuart Mill, and his perspective on liberal democracy has to be equally considered, because when Mill is looking at democracy, he talks about democracy as a socio-economic equality, and this is a necessary element of democracy. Now, but at the same time, continuing with Montesquieu and Locke and James Mill, his father, he is also skeptical about every citizen's right to govern. So, as a result of all this, that limited franchise, we saw in democracies of that time that the right to vote was limited. Sometimes the restrictions there were different aspects of restriction. Sometimes it was census voting, that the wealth criteria, if you had a certain amount of wealth, you paid a certain amount of tax, you were entitled to vote. At other times, we had the capacity voting, that is, if you have a certain education level, then only can you vote. And then still in other countries like Latin America, South Africa, we had racial voting, that is, only people of a particular race would vote, the others were left out of the voting procedure. For example, we saw in South Africa the election to remove apartheid was the first multiracial election. So John Stuart Mill was always very skeptical. He did not believe in universal adult franchise, and he said that because governance as a task, it required expertise. So now, if to elect an expert, people needed to have certain level of qualification. But then he also went on to say that if we allow maximum participation at the lower level, this would educate people in governance. So he was not against people's participation, but for election at higher level, he wanted a certain level of criteria to be involved. Now, going from the liberal perspective, there were certain shortcomings. Then there were countries who would not agree. So then we had emergence of different model of democracy or different view on democracy, and this was called the Neoclassical liberal perspective. Now, the advantage of this democracy, this Neoclassical liberal perspective, was that it did not come up in a vacuum. It came up in an environment that was already democratic. So it has an advantage because it was only trying to improve upon what is already there, and then it had a background. It could look into the shortcomings and improve upon the shortcomings, and then give a theory which could take into account all the shortcomings, all the advantages, all the environmental situations and all. So this neoclassical perspective, it was egalitarianist because it was against class distinction. So it said that there should be equality, and all the distinction based on class had, to some extent, this distinction had to be retained, and majoritarianism was also set aside. So in short, the neoclassical perspective, they were trying to put aside a bit of egalitarianism and majoritarianism, and they substituted the limited voting rights for equal representation. This was the most important contribution. Now, democratic socialism, it arose from the assumption that every human is equal, and the neoclassical liberal perspective was it was trying to have a bridge between classical, that is a liberal perspective, and the socialist perspective. So it was kind of a bridge, but as I told you earlier, the advantage was that it was created in an environment which is already democratic. So it is easy for them to give prescriptions. Then as a transition, then we move on to the socialist view. So this is the next stage of democratic view, a perspective. Now, what do you mean by the socialistic view? The political power to protect and advance the interest of a minority. So this is very important. And the power derives from the control of means of production. So this is a very, very typically socialist and Marxist view, which says that the ownership of means of production, it divides the society into classes, and those who own the means of production are in a situation of power. So then they go on to argue that inequality is not natural, it is a creation of mankind. It is a product of social and economic arrangement, and especially of the capitalist market economy, because they want to have a division in the society. They want the labor to be living at the subsistence level, because the moment they are at subsistence level, they will be forced to come back to work the next day. So they were given the minimum wages and subsistence wages, and all this was a ploy of the capitalists to keep the inequalities wide and to help to keep the laborers coming back to them, because their contention was, at least we are giving them employment. And but the problem with the socialistic view, it prevents people from political involvement, because it is more about economy, it is more about distribution of the surplus value, it is more about the ownership of means of production. So the obsession of the people moves from political aspects to economic aspirations. So it kind of prevents people from political involvement. Now, if we look at some of the thinkers, how they look at the socialistic and what is their view on the socialist perspective, we look at Marx and Engels. They plead relative autonomy of the state from dominant class. For them, socialism or democracy is when this dominant class, which is the workers' class or the proletariat class, is relieved from the clutches of the capitalist class. And because according to him, the state was an executive committee of the capitalist society, so he thought that when the moment the dominant working class, it comes out of the clutches of the state, it is democracy. Then Marx was very much against Tocqueville's view that democracy led to tyranny of masses. And if it does not tackle inequities of power, it is sham. So if it is true democracy according to Marx, it has to tackle the differences in power standard or power structure. All the inequalities in the society must go, and if they do not go, it is just a farce, it is just not democracy. And they were very critical of the democratic rights and the cornerstone of liberal democracy. They said that the way these democratic rights have been granted by the liberal society are not right. They were just criticizing that. Then in all this, while they were having their own model, and they were criticizing the liberal perspective, then the liberal perspective. So what is the solution that they dished out? The socialistic solution. They said they must endorse participatory democracy, which meaning thereby participation of the working class. And communists went on to say that a single party must assume the leadership. So now if we are talking about a single party assuming leadership or a one party democracy, we are moving towards authoritarianism, or we are moving towards a kind of dictatorship. But for communists, it was right. They believed in a one party system. Then reconcile the socialist aims and liberal democratic institutions. All right. So this is a very, very valid argument that they give. They say that the socialistic aims are the best, and the institutions of liberal democratic countries are the best. So the best solution or the best panacea for this ill would be to have socialistic aims with liberal democratic institutions. So in a way, they were also endorsing the democratic institutions of the liberal societies. Now, as always, they said that the surplus value, the means of production should be owned by the society, and the surplus value or the profit must be distributed within the society. So in that sense, then they gave a solution which was collective management of affairs. So economic democracy was for them very important, and in that the management of the governance would be done by a collective group of workers. There would be no division between the owner and the wage laborer. So this is for them democracy. This is for them economic democracy. Now, this kind of a process, which needed a breakaway from the liberal capitalist society to a socialist notion where there would be a U-turn in the entire economic structure, this would have to be a gradual process. And then it could, if it was a gradual process, then it could correct injustices of capitalism. But if not every Marxist or not every socialist are agreed with this gradual process, because there were certain socialists who were evolutionary, who believed, like the Fabian socialists, they believed that the transition could be slow and gradual or evolutionary, that is, we had to respect the constitution. But there were others within the fold who would say that we must take recourse to revolutionary methods, because a system which is deeply entrenched for a very long time, a system which is highly based on economic criteria, will not let go of its powers very easily. So to overthrow that power, we needed to have force, and that was the revolutionary method that Marx had also prescribed. So now when we talk about the socialistic view, that means we are looking to an egalitarian democracy, and there would be no ruling class or the ruler class, everybody would be made fit to rule. Now in that perspective, if we advance our perspective of egalitarianism, we cannot leave the feminist view aside. The feminist perspective, we have done feminism earlier. The feminist perspective is very important because they are the groups who are also seeking equal rights, because even in the advanced European and the liberal European societies, there had been discriminations against women, and I would be talking about that. And let me begin with Aristotle. Aristotle, on his concept of ruler, he had said that male are more capable to rule by nature, and thus setting aside the aspirations of women to rule. And and all through the ages, we have seen that between men and women there have been unequal power relations. Women have always been subdued, and their domain has been the domestic chores, and they have not been encouraged at least to move out of this domestic domain. Now, so much so that the liberals, they kept the family out of the process of democratization. So for them, they said the family is not a unit of democracy. The family is a unit which has to be kept aside, and women as caretakers of that family had also to be set aside and not part of the democratization process. So women were alienated from the political process. They did not have voting rights for very long. For example, I'm quoting the example of Switzerland. As late as 1971, the women were denied voting rights. So many of the countries, they did not like the women to vote. And I'm talking about one of the advanced economies and one of the most liberal countries in Europe, Switzerland, which only as late as 1971 their women started voting. Sometimes in other countries, the women were also excluded from citizenship by many of the political thinkers. Many of the political thinkers would categorize citizenship, and in their scheme of citizenship, women would not fit anywhere. They would describe, for example, Plato, he describes about the ruler class, the philosopher ruler, then he talks about métisses, he talks about the auxiliary groups, but openly at least, there is no mention of the women class. So the feminists revolted to this. They did not want this. Their perspective was that, look, if it is a democracy, if it is talking about equal rights, then women also qualify for attaining these rights. Now, if we look at our own situation in India, they are grossly underrepresented in decision making, and that is why we have certain revolts asking for more representation of women in the Lok Sabha. For example, in India, women in Lok Sabha have always been less than 12%. So their representation has never gone beyond 12%. Now, the most important thing is that the entire societal makeup, entire democratic setup has been in a way that it understands the difference between man and women as a disadvantage. So this is the feminist perspective, that doing away with this understanding, this notion that the difference between man and woman is a disadvantage, has to be done away with. And this has led to gender bias in democratic theory. And the feminist perspective is to contend this gender bias which has erupted in the democratic system. Now, to ensure equality, it must recognize and accommodate the differences. So, you have to recognize that yes, men and women have different they have different constitutional, different physical makeup, and you have to sort of accommodate those, recognize that yes, these differences, and some of them are natural, some of them are societal, some of them are inherent, and some of them have been artificial, but then recognizing this difference and accommodating them becomes very important. So for them, for the women's, for the feminist perspective, the process of democratization for them is the process of empowerment. So once you empower the women, they feel that they are part of the democratic process. So what they want is, their demand is an active and participatory practice of democracy, active and participatory, and there would be no discrimination based on the gender. So now, having given the feminist perspective, we come to different other minor perspectives which were also being raised in different parts of the world. For example, if we look at another perspective which is called the deliberative view. Now, this deliberative view was given by David Miller and Joshua Cohen. It literally means that people's preferences are formed during the political process and not prior to it. So they say that once we have an impending election, we will take up issues, then we will articulate demands, we will have public opinion gathering. So all these preferences are only done during the political process and not prior to it. And democracy for them, for the deliberative school, is arriving at an agreed upon judgment or consensus. So once they have formed preferences, now the elections would be contested on the basis of these preferences, and democracy, when the government comes, it is on the basis of the agreed upon judgment or consensus, because they give lot of value to deliberation and debate and discussion. So because these judgments or these consensus that have come out are the outcomes of detailed discussions, deliberations and debates. And they also encourage open participation and unlimited dialogue. Open participation meaning that nobody should be kept out. As far as possible, we should have extensive and wide network of dialogues and public opinion gathering, and unlimited dialogue. That is, the time frame should also be sufficient to have opinion building. Now, what is the outcome of the deliberative view? The outcome of the deliberative view is that the people have become aware and they have started forming their own opinion about the different perspectives. They are trying to use the information which is available for creation of demands or consensus. Now, the second aspect, the second outcome of deliberative view is there are varied preferences and interests that are transformed into a common agreement. So, to have everybody agree, for example, Bentham also, when he was talking about the utilitarian perspective, he was talking about greatest good of the greatest number. He was well aware that everybody cannot be satisfied and we cannot do good of everyone. So the issue is that if most of us have agreed, then that is good enough. So the varied preferences and interests are transformed into a common agreement. Common agreement thereby meaning an agreement which is agreeable to a lot of people. And then we have a participatory model where the keystone is dialogue. As I told you, it is dialogue, it is deliberation, it is discussion and debate. And so consensus building is because of these important processes. And the height of building up of consensus for them is an idle speech situation. But every system has its own drawbacks, and so also the deliberative view has its own setback. The drawback of this system is that consensus of view is difficult in a diverse and complex society. Now all the societies, all modern day societies are not homogeneous societies. They are heterogeneous societies, there are different cultural groups, there are different ethnic identities, there are different racial identities, and having a consensus in all this is not possible. So the deliberative view also is good enough, but it has its own drawback. So now from the feminist perspective, then we had a deliberative perspective. It would have been important if we look at the multiculturalist perspective also in the democratic setup. Now it is very much similar to the feminist argument that there are differences between cultures, and highlighting those differences would create dissensions in the society. So the best way is to accommodate the differences, and this is a prescription given by federalists also all over the world, accommodating diversities. So this is the best model that you could have if you have a heterogeneous society. Now in culturally plural society, laws and practices they obviously reflect the cultural bias of the majority. And this is the contention of the multiculturalists. They don't want this. To treat all differences as disadvantages is to use the dominant group's culture as a norm. So the norm is set, and the norm is the culture of the dominant group. And not recognizing the differences is to ignore diversity. There are diversities, and you just cannot turn your head and say that, no, this is we have created a completely homogeneous society. No, there are differences, and you have to recognize those differences. And if these differences are recognized, then you are creating a good democracy. And the solution then should be based on accommodating the diversity. Now those not conforming to the dominant culture, this is the practice, and this is the accusation of the multiculturalists, that those not conforming to the dominant culture have to lose their identity, or they have to get assimilated in the process. So this is, they don't like this. Why should a group lose its identity? Why should a group be assimilated? Why can't it be accommodated? So now the solution that they give out, after having seen all the problems that emerge from the cultural perspective, they give out certain solutions, and the underlying recognition or underlying point or argument of all the solutions that they say is recognizing and representing diversity within a society or a democratic country. Now Iris Marion Young goes on to say that there are certain pillars of recognizing and representing diversity, and the first one is there should be procedure to ensure additional representation for the oppressed groups. Then there should be certain affirmative action and funding for organizing the groups. So while they are trying to organize their activities for seeking greater representation or seeking their recognition, all these activities while they are mobilizing, there should be special funding by maybe the government. And there should be affirmative action in terms of constitutional provisions, and there should be certain rules, enabling acts to help them get assimilated. Now consultation on policy matters which include them has to be very important. Any matter which is concerning them, these cultural groups must be consulted. And they must have the veto power over policies which affect them. There are certain policies which affect them, and if they do not have a say, so what happens is that there are acts made or laws made, and their point of view has totally been left out. So Young suggests that they should have veto power over any policy which is concerning them. Then Will Kemelika, who has written a lot on diverse cultural diversities and indigenous issues in federalism, goes on to say that self-governance rights for indigenous people are very important. So all the indigenous people should have the right of self-governance, and the ethnic groups should have cultural rights. So trying to separate the two, that is, the indigenous group people who find it very difficult to get assimilated and their worldview is totally different. So we should give them some kind of autonomy by giving them the right of self-governance, and there should be special affirmative actions, constitutional provisions to protect or provide cultural rights to the ethnic groups. Now in all this debate, while we were trying to have a division on the basis of race, on the basis of culture, on the basis of ethnic identity, and then on the basis of gender, on the basis of their perception of the economic system, like the liberal and the socialist view, we cannot leave out this perspective which is based on the difference in the age, that is the youth. So what is the perspective of the youth? Now, as we know that most of the societies, it's a youthful society, and the youth have the largest stake in ensuring that democracy is upheld and maintained. Now it is through this generation that we are trying to implement policies. It is through this generation that we are trying to prove the effectiveness or gather the effectiveness of democracy. So gauging democracy, gauging its drawbacks, or judging its contributions are most effectively done if we take into consideration the youth. And as we have seen in the recent years, all these revolutions, the so-called colored revolutions in the Middle East, have been inspired, and they may have been inspired by some elderly people, but the most important component of these revolutions have been youth. Even social movements in India these days, they are spearheaded by the youth. The recent in the India against corruption, it is quite a youthful movement, so as to say. And the reason why does youth now need a greater participation in democracy? Because they are the ones who are affected the most economically. Any social disruption, any economic disruption that is happening, and we see that it is the youth class which is most importantly affected. In terms of unemployment, then they have to undergo migration because jobs are not there. Even if jobs are there, they are not aplenty. So this leads to a feeling of alienation among the youth. So there are two categories. A, that they'll become apathetic, they will have the feeling of alienation and they will not like to contribute and they'll just stay away. On the other extreme is when seeing all this, they cannot take it any longer and they have a desire to revolt. Now, why is the alienation of youth, so as to say? If we were to say that the youth were quiet for so many years, it is only now that they are participating. So what were the reason? Now, I like to quote Aristotle again, and he had a notion that the ruler had to be elder and perfect. So even his view was that young people cannot take up leadership responsibility. So for Aristotle, the ruler had to be elder and perfect. And perfect, if you become perfect only either through education or through age and wisdom, which mostly comes with age. So in a way, Aristotle was trying to say that youth can have role in election or selection, but to rule or to be an effective ruler, we needed elderly and perfect people. So that and throughout the years, they never developed into major interest organizations or political parties, except maybe for green issues, environmental issues. We had green parties because it is more fashionable. Then we had women's interest groups. So only the peripheral issues had involvement of the youth. And in a competitive world, the youth were forced to be conformist. They had to be agree by the dominant view, the dominant governance, the dominant system, because it was it was a feeling that if they wanted to have a share and a say, they must keep quiet and conform to the system that was prevalent. So people said that the youth should be included. The youth should be included in democracy. So the perspective of the youth was now that we should be included and we should have more say in this participatory democracy. So boosting young people's involvement was important. Improving their understanding of the democratic process was another important aspect. Their participation in the decision-making structure had to be taken into account, and there had to be a dialogue, structured dialogue between decision makers and young people. That is, the young people had to be not alienated but incorporated into the mainstream of decision making in a democracy. And the themes then, they were also talking about cultural diversity, social inclusion, removal of gender biases, environmental issues. So these were some of the new issues in which we can incorporate the youth, and their role becomes very important in democracy. So the recent development has been that youth have started questioning the old ways of politicking. They want a much more inclusive and participatory democratic system. They are also wanting that before decisions are made, there should be frequent and real hearings and consultations with this group. And for example, I would like to quote the example of Germany. In a recent election, the Youth Party got 10% of the vote and their first seats in the Berlin State Assembly. And they have now become a new force in the German political landscape. So they are a force to reckon. So now, amongst all this, what was it? All these different perspectives, but the outline desire was that they wanted democracy. Only the ultimate goal was the same. The end was the same. It was democracy. But the means to achieving that end and the outlook or the design of that model were different according to the different perspectives. Now, why did people agree that democracy was the best and it still happens to be the good option available in the world? And now I would like to talk about the democratic peace theory, and which believes that democratic states are more peaceful by nature. Kant in the 18th century is the most important protagonist of this view. He said that international relations also are very, very peaceful because he was the one who talked about the concept of having a world government. 1980s again, then we lost him for some time. 1980s again, this theory was revived by Michael Doyle, who had two hypotheses. This concept of democratic peace theory has two hypotheses. One is that democracies never fight or use force in mutual relations. And second, that democracies' interaction with non-democracies are more conflictual. So democracy with democracy cordial, and democracy with non-democracy is conflictual. This is the perspective. And it is due to the constraints of constitutionalism and other norms that conflicts are avoided. So the role of constitutionalism now comes in, that all these conflicts are avoided because we have a faith in constitutionalism. Now, what are the deficits of democratic system? Why are we questioning the democratic system? A perceived deficit in the way a particular arrangement works in practice against a benchmark of it that is supposed to work. So we have created a benchmark of democracy. It is not performing up to the benchmark, and then we perceive that there is a deficit in performance, and this is called perceived democratic deficit. This is seen prominently in the context of European Union. Now, with delegation and pooling of sovereignty to the European Union, the role of the citizens to hold national policy makers accountable has been reduced, and that is why the citizenry is not liking it. And then we had certain alternatives to democracy also being contemplated, that look, if democracy is not good, why don't we think of alternative models? And in this process, Bernheim in 1985, he suggested that let us not have elections. He suggested a democracy where the implementation of a government or governance would be through a selection of people. So he was trying to do away with election, and so obviously this was not liked by many people. Then Aaron Lippert talks about consociational democracy. It is a democracy with a fragmented political culture and stabilized through government by an elite cartel. So this was the model that of consociational democracy which Lippert was suggesting, and it was being practiced in Austria, Belgium, Netherlands and Northern Ireland. And then coming to the conclusion about how democracy, how democratic constitutionalism, all these things have evolved, how they have graduated and grown, and why is it that they are being criticized. I would just like to quote Huntington in 1991. He said that democratization developed in a series of bursts or waves with many transitions, followed by going back to non-democratic regimes. That we followed democratic regimes, then because of certain issues or certain problems, we again went back to the non-democratic regimes. So it was a cycle of democratization, non-democratization, again democratization, very clearly seen in the Latin American countries and the African countries. Now the interest from structural elements has shifted to non-structural determinants, other things, not the structural of the structure of democracy. They are not criticizing the structure, how to achieve that structure, what are the determinants in achieving that structure. That is being they wanting a shift in that. Now 21st century, the form and quality is more important. I'm sorry, there's a mistake here. Form and quality is more important rather than the quality. So what matters is the quality of democracy that we have. We don't want more and more countries coming under the democratic fold. That is not important. What is important is what is the form, what is the outlook of democracy that has emerged. And constitutional engineers have become interested in knowing why some systems perform better. So we are also deliberating and going deep into finding out the performances of different democracies, why certain democracies are better, why certain democracies are not so good. And then I would like to conclude by Noam Chomsky's quote, who says, everybody is for democracy in principle. It's only in practice that the things give rise to stiff opposition. So theoretically, democracy is the best possible option that we have, but when we start practicing, there are different variants that evolve, and how these variants, are they degenerating, are they becoming more evolved and positive, that is the problem, and this is what gives rise to opposition on having different perspectives and views on democracy. So I think with this we conclude the lecture.
Okay. How do you see in Indian context when the youth are more inclined to about fulfilling their own aspiration and need, and least about the democratic value, anything? Their primary focus is just to fulfill their needs.
Yes.
So how they will sync with this theoretical and the other challenges they have to face in the day-to-day practicing democracy?
Yes. The youth, as I already said, the youth have two problems. One is that they feel alienated, and the other problem is that they feel so much part of the process that they want to revolt. So the cause of alienation is the process of globalization, the rising unemployment, and when they see, they have a certain kind of a lifestyle that they see for themselves, and they want to emulate the other country's lifestyle. So what happens is, in the process, they just become very individualistic. They are only worried about my individual rights, my own progression, and they feel they have a sense of alienation, that this democratic system is a farce. It cannot take care of their problems, and this is why in India it is a major problem. But we cannot say that it will remain a problem, because with the recent developments during the Anna Hazare movement, we see that the youth was a major force. So I think things are not that bad. We are coming back. We are looking.
So is that only law will help, or is, you suggest as entire structural changes for the structural changes need to be taken care of so that a student could, youth can get a space in the participatory democracy.
No, you're very right. I agree that just making laws are not enough. You have to have structural changes. And when you have structural changes, then you have to change, there has to be changes in the economic system, there has to be changes in the socio-cultural aspects, then there have to be more opportunities which have to be opened up. And I don't think law alone can suffice. There has to be structural changes, there has to be motivational courses so that they feel proud of their system, of their country, and I think this is the way to bring them into the mainstream.
Okay. So, well, friends, we would like to conclude the lecture as Dr. Aparajita Kashyap said in Noam Chomsky words. Everybody like for the democratic in principle, but nobody is satisfied with its practicability and that is being practiced in a ways. So, we would like to conclude here, and I thank all of you for watching the lecture. And on your behalf, I thank Dr. Aparajita Kashyap for giving such an insightful lecture. Thank you very much.